2005, the United States was in its fifth year of efforts to reform its election system. The hotly contested and controversial 2000 presidential election had identified flaws in the nation's registration and voting laws that were seen to contribute to a lack of confidence in election outcomes. A 2002 bill called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, addressed some of those issues but failed to settle all of the arguments that had arisen around election reform. State laws requiring voters to provide photo identification were generating backlash amid claims of disenfranchisement. Worry about new voting technology was leading to fears of counting errors, and growing numbers of absentee and mail ballots were raising concerns about the possibility of fraud. In response, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker agreed to co-chair a bipartisan commission housed at Washington, D.C.'s American University to examine these and other outstanding election reform issues. The final report, entitled Building Confidence in U.S. Elections, stressed the important role of elections to the nation's democracy and made a series of recommendations, some controversial at the time, that sought to protect access to polls and the integrity of the election process. These included a national system to connect state and local voter registration lists, voter identification based on universally available real ID cards, policies to improve voter access for all communities, as well as innovations like vote centers and voter information lookup sites, stronger efforts to combat fraud, especially in absentee voting, while recognizing the need for more research and accumulated experience, and auditable paper backups for all voting technology. 16 years and 4 presidential elections later, many of the challenges that the Commission recognized have been addressed and are now familiar aspects of the American voting experience. Yet they remain central to current election reform debates. In this panel series, we will be revisiting key issues in the Carter-Baker report and assessing how they can help foster constructive dialogue on election reforms and contribute to building confidence in U.S. elections.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the first in a 5-part series of discussions on election reform in the United States, viewed through the lens of the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform. My name is David Carroll. I'm the director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. We're co-organizing the series of panel discussions with Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words of background and also acknowledge the role of our founders at the Carter Center and the Baker Institute, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker III. In 2005, when President Carter and Secretary Baker convened their bipartisan commission, the United States was in a period when confidence in elections was waning and partisan politics was hampering our ability as a nation to forge consensus solutions to difficult election issues and problems around our elections. Although there were some heated debate and clear differences of opinion that were voiced during the deliberations of the 2005 commission, in the end, all 21 members of the commission signed its final report. 16 years and 4 election cycles later, and on the heels of the particularly divisive 2020 elections, the Carter Center and the Baker Institute have come together in the hope that we might be able to play a constructive role in fostering constructive dialogue on solutions to problems in U.S. elections. To further set the stage and to introduce the panelists for today's discussion and the subject for today's discussion, I turn to my colleague at the Baker Institute, John Williams. John, it's a pleasure.
Thank you, David. On behalf of Mark Jones, my colleague at the Baker Institute, and myself, I want to add that you, Avery Davis Roberts, and the entire staff of the Carter Center have been an absolute joy to work with. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. At this moment in early 2021, Americans are deeply divided, and polling shows that many continue to lack confidence in our elections and lack confidence that they are conducted fairly. Across the nation, politicians and activists are locked in fierce debates about electoral reform. Against that backdrop, our 2 institutions which, by the way, are both nonpartisan, thought it important to bring together knowledgeable, reasonable people to talk to each other rather than at each other, with the hope of finding solutions. Following the lead of President Carter and Secretary Baker, we hope that this series of discussions will contribute to the national debate by focusing on how bipartisan exchanges can help find answers that are needed to build confidence in our system. Taking such an approach is important, we believe, because as the very first line of the executive summary of the Carter-Baker Report observed, building confidence in U.S. elections is central to our nation's democracy. Many thanks to our panelists for agreeing to be part of these important conversations, and to Carter Center CEO, Paige Alexander, and Baker Institute founding director, Ed Durigeon, for supporting our efforts. The title of today's discussion is Election Integrity and Ballot Access. They are, of course, the yin and yang of elections. That is, although yin and yang may be perceived as opposites, they're really about balance and harmony. So too are election integrity and ballot access. We have a smart and savvy panel to discuss this topic, and it includes Susan Molinari, former Congresswoman from New York and a member of the 2005 Carter-Baker Commission, Maggie Toulouse Oliver, Secretary of State of New Mexico, Sharon Priest, former Secretary of State of Arkansas, and also a member of the 2005 Carter-Baker Commission, and Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State of Georgia. Our moderator is Doug Chapman, Director of Election Research at the Forrest Marsh Group, and in 2005, he served as Director of Research for the Carter-Baker Commission. In a moment, we'll turn over the event to Mr. Chapin and the panel. But first, we have this video.
In 2005, the United States was in its 5th year of efforts to reform its election system. The hotly contested and controversial 2000 presidential election had identified flaws in the nation's registration and voting laws that were seen to contribute to a lack of confidence in election outcomes. A 2002 bill called the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, addressed some of those issues but failed to settle all of the arguments that had arisen around election reform. State laws requiring voters to provide photo identification were generating backlash amid claims of disenfranchisement. Worry about new voting technology was leading to fears of counting errors, and growing numbers of absentee and mail ballots were raising concerns about the possibility of fraud. In response, former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker agreed to co-chair a bipartisan commission housed at Washington, D.C.'s American University to examine these and other outstanding election reform issues. The final report, entitled Building Confidence in U.S. Elections, stressed the important role of elections to the nation's democracy and made a series of recommendations, some controversial at the time, that sought to protect access to polls and the integrity of the election process. These included a national system to connect state and local voter registration lists, voter identification based on universally available real ID cards, policies to improve voter access for all communities, as well as innovations like vote centers and voter information lookup sites, stronger efforts to combat fraud, especially in absentee voting, while recognizing the need for more research and accumulated experience, and auditable paper backups for all voting technology. 16 years and 4 presidential elections later, many of the challenges that the Commission recognized have been addressed and are now familiar aspects of the American voting experience. Yet they remain central to current election reform debates. In this panel series, we will be revisiting key issues in the Carter-Baker Report and assessing how they can help foster constructive dialogue on election reforms and contribute to building confidence in U.S. elections.
Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome. My name is Doug Chapman. I'm with the Forrest Marsh Group in Washington, D.C. Also, as John mentioned, way back in the day, I was a research director of the Carter-Baker Commission as part of my duties at electionline.org. Really happy to have all of you with us, especially happy to have the members of our panel with us. I'm looking forward to a great conversation today. As John and David both mentioned, conversation is something that we don't seem to do as much these days in the field of elections, and we're hoping to revive that lost art where we can exchange ideas and find solutions that work for everyone at every level of government. So first, as a warm-up and a welcome to our various panelists, I want to start with our two returning commissioners, Susan Molinari and Sharon Priest. It has, as the kids say, been a minute since 2005. But just to each of you, what do you as former commissioners think is the most important legacy of the Carter Baker Commission?
Does Sharon want to go first, or is Sharon even here?
There she is.
Okay.
There I am. Well, to me, I think the important legacy of the Carter Baker Commission is that we worked bipartisanly and we looked for solutions. We weren't trying to make political points in particular, but we were trying to see if we could find common ground to make elections accessible and to have the integrity that the people of this country deserve.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing when you gave us that question ahead of time. The first thing I wrote down was the most important legacy was that it was bipartisan, that there was a lot of discussion, that there was a lot of listening, and that we did not use it as a weapon against each other or the other political parties. It was, we left there with a feeling like whether we agreed or disagreed with everything or one or two of those things, that together as a commission, we were going to present it and stand for it and stand by it. And I think that's something that's so missing in today's discussions where, you know, any type of looking for a solution, as Sharon said, it's used as a political tool. Now, a lot of what we looked at seems so quaint right now based on what's happening in the United States and what has happened in that minute, because the issues have just gotten so much more complex, which we'll discuss with regard to social media, et cetera. I think some of the things we did advance, though, was talking about the disenfranchisement of ex-felons. It was something that seems so open and positive right now, but was, you know, was a little more complex at the time. TV's not calling elections or predicting elections before everybody voted. Again, that's something the television and media have resisted doing, but complicated the situation back then. And lastly, I think one of the great things that we did, although it has fallen off, and I'd love to see us do this again, is empowering the Election Assistance Commission and giving them the right resources that they need. So what we did back in the day was empowering and recognizing the importance of the EAC based on the complexities and the partisanship that would always be available when we have these debates, because voting is so important to who we are as a country.
I also think we had an emphasis on voters with disabilities.
Yes.
And I think that was really important, and I think that has continued to this day.
Well, great. And then to our other two panelists, our two current secretaries of state, let me take a similar question and kind of fast forward us 16 years. As current players in the election community, I mean, you're obviously familiar with the hurly-burly of election policy debates. To what extent do you think efforts like the Carter Baker Commission and other bipartisan efforts can be useful in helping us both address and get through some of the issues we face today? Secretary Raffensperger, can I start with you?
You have the video turned off for some reason. It's at your end too. The host has disabled it.
Can we turn his video back on? There he is.
Thank you. Great. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to think that we can move forward and start having a clear bipartisan discussion on how elections should run. But it's certainly not happening, at least from what we're seeing here in Georgia. We've had front row seats for misinformation and disinformation, probably going all the way back to the 2018 cycle. After that election, it had a narrative of voter suppression. The numbers didn't support that allegation, didn't support the claims. But then also, if you look at this last year in the 2020 cycle, it was instead of voter fraud, now it's voter fraud instead of voter suppression. But at the end of the day, that was not supported by the facts. But it would be very helpful if we can move forward in a bipartisan nature to address these issues. They're serious issues, and it creates an awful lot of division within society. And if we can move forward, I think that would be very helpful. You have to give a shout out to the 2005 Carter Baker Report Commission. that many of us lean into it as we're looking at legislation. What have we done and what do we have left to do?
Yes, as the old saying goes, we are cursed with living in interesting times. Secretary Oliver?
Well, I think this dialogue is more important than ever, this bipartisan dialogue. I mean, I think we've seen, and I think anybody who lived through January 6th of this year really saw that the toxic and partisan rhetoric, particularly around election administration in this country, culminated in a truly tragic day in American history. So as an election administrator and as somebody who believes really strongly in working across the aisle, and I'm really pleased to be here today with my colleague Brad and the Honorable Congresswoman, former Congresswoman and Secretary of State as well. This is the most important time to have that dialogue. And, I think to Secretary Raffensperger's point, one of the biggest challenges we're facing is sort of agreeing on what is, right? And doing as much as we possibly can to get on the same page about what is and focus on where we can find that common ground and agreement. That is going to be where we need to start. And so, just to reiterate, I think this kind of dialogue is more important now than ever, perhaps.
Well, wonderful. Let's see if we can't get a little bit of that dialogue going. With your continued indulgence, I just thought I'd start with another question to each one of our 4 panelists. And let me go ahead and start with you, Sharon. And it's going to look like I'm reading this because I am. Well, what's often framed perhaps in exaggerated or sometimes unhelpful ways as a tension in elections between access and integrity was a key feature of the original Carter-Baker Commission's deliberations. How, in your opinion, has the issue of access and integrity evolved in the 16 years since the 2005 report? And to what extent does integrity and improving integrity create a tension with expanding access?
Well, I may have a longer answer than you really want, but I'm going to say that I don't believe that the tension between accessibility and integrity is really going to ever be resolved. I think when you have a winner and a loser, somebody, usually the loser, has a problem and they blame the elections process for their losing. So I think that's something that we have to realize, that access and integrity are always going to be a little bit at odds. I think since 2005, one of the things that has changed is we have not been able to continue to have bipartisan discussions. And that has really, I think, affected particularly accessibility, in my opinion, more so than the integrity. HAVA did a lot to help deal with voter registration, statewide voter registrations. I don't know that we've ever got totally to national lists, but that's something that probably would be helpful and make people feel more confident from state to state that people aren't voting in Arkansas and voting in Georgia at the same time. There were more votes cast in 2020 than in any previous election. And I think there was a lot of things that made that happen. First of all, I think election officials over the years have worked really hard to get voters out to the polls. They have worked to improve the access, and they've worked to improve the integrity. And I really think that that's been an important piece of that. The pandemic also created opportunities for access to the polls in the interest of public health. So rules and regulations were amended to allow that, to allow people to vote by mail, no excuse absentee voting. I think Texas, I don't know if the whole state, but part of the state had drive-through voting. So I think that really did help increase the access. election officials have advocated for, as long as I can remember, for eligible voters to vote. I know that I have always told people, or I've always believed that people want to know that not only will their vote count, but that it will be counted. And to me, that's the access and the integrity parts of it. And I don't think you get integrity by limiting access. Some things that I think we need to be keeping in mind is that we're all human. Humans make mistakes. And a lot of these elections, we have to understand, we have poll workers all over the country. Most of those poll workers are retired, and 12-hour days create fatigue, and fatigue often creates errors. But I think that can be resolved by training, which Carter Baker Commission asked for, training of younger people as poll workers. And perhaps we need to look at doing shifts as opposed to having one person working a poll, for 12 hours straight. Instant gratification, Susan talked about that a little bit in terms of media. I mean, we're in an instant gratification society, and everybody wants to know the results immediately. Well, that just can't happen, nor do I believe should it. Elections have to be certified, and in order to certify, you have to make sure all the votes are in. Military and overseas ballots, I can think of at least 5 instances in Arkansas where one military or overseas ballot came in and made the difference in an election. And that happened last year in a primary election here. So that's critical that we have the ability to certify the vote, and we need to allow that. Most, if all, states have laws against electioneering, and I think part of the problem is we are not enforcing the laws that we have on the books. We keep creating new laws more and more and get more and more detailed instead of legislators dealing with policy and elections officials carrying out that policy. So I'm an advocate for enforcing the laws that we already have on the books. There is no question that social media and outside influencers are making a difference in both access and integrity. And social media was something that we weren't dealing with really 16 years ago. Technology is changing. It's a wonderful science, and we need to use the science to improve access and integrity. And Secretary Raffensperger talked about all the studies. I think it was he who talked about that. Let's review all those studies that have been done on elections. Let's put them together and see where the commonalities are, and see if we can't use that as a working document to push forward the changes for access and integrity. And then finally, democracy relies on trust. I may be naive, but I believe most people are honest. And I think accessibility and integrity are imperative to having free and fair elections to preserve our democratic republic. Sorry, I went a little bit long, but.
You can never be too thorough. I appreciate it. Representative Molinari, you were a strong voice for the concept of integrity during the Carter Baker Commission's deliberations. In the current environment, what's the greatest threat to the idea of integrity, and how do we address it? And I guess, flip side to what I asked Secretary Priest, to what extent does improving access create a tension with integrity of the process?
So without trying to not repeat everything that Sharon said, which she was just right on point with. Okay, I'm trying to think if I want to rip the Band-Aid off this early. So first of all, I agree with her. I don't think there needs to be tension between access and integrity. And I think the last election, though there were some hiccups, showed that there didn't need to be, as Sharon said, we had, more people voting, we had drop boxes all over, we had early voting, we had mail-ins, we did things that we never did before to increase access. And in fact, we increased voter participation, and there was very little questioning on integrity. With all due respect to Secretary Raffensperger and what he had to go through, we know that there was, that this was an election that was called with integrity. Okay, ripping the Band-Aid off. How do we ensure that people can trust the elections? Look, I mean, the biggest issue we had in the last election was the president, the former president, President Trump, who, continued to say that the election was stolen, that this was not integrity, that there were behind the scenes steals. And so for everything that we discussed, 16 years ago, and what we have been doing as a country leading up to today, we now still have today 3/4 of Republicans in the United States believing that President Trump was duly elected president and that Joe Biden stole it. So somewhere along the line, and you need a therapist to get through this more than I can, we've got to figure out how we make sure that people understand that the system has a bunch of checks and balances. It's kind of frightening to think where we would be today if we were not blessed with Governor Kemp and Secretary Raffensperger and Gordon Sterling to really stand up to all the pressure that they had to, sure, still going through, in terms of all the issues that we had with regard to, having electors not represent what the votes were in their area. There's just so many things that we dealt with on social media, on regular media, put forth by President Trump and his acolytes, and very damaging. Again, I will just go back to the fact that when we get to a point where 2/3 of, a major party in the United States still has not accepted the results of the last election as legitimate. Things that we talked about, I said last time, were so quaint. I mean, we're going to always have a disagreement, and we need to talk about voter ID cards. But, when we talk about why people don't trust the system today, it has nothing to do with anything we discussed in 2005. It has to do with the ability for our national leaders to stand together to say, this is the vote and we will abide by it. It is the peaceful transfer of power that really just didn't happen. And we didn't address that 16 years ago. And certainly as a nation, we have to figure out how we address this. But, again, it gives me a great pleasure to be with the Secretary of State, who is, you can agree with him and disagree with him on a whole bunch of other issues, but he's a national hero.
I'm not muted anymore. Sorry about that. Secretary Raffensperger, there's been a lot of discussion about the issue of ballot integrity in Georgia, both before and after last November's elections. Did you see much, if any, voter fraud in your state? And if not, what precautions did the Peach State have in place that helped guarantee ballot integrity?
Well, as I've repeatedly said, we did not see any widespread voting fraud that would actually overturn the results we had in the election. We did see certain issues, small amount of ballots being cast by ineligible voters, but that happens in every election because federal law and state law err on the side of letting someone vote, and then afterwards, then that's when you'll prosecute that. We had a small handful, less than a handful of dead voters. It was actually 2, a small amount of felon voters, double voters, and people who are no longer Georgia residents who cast ballots. But each of those issues, other than felon voters, actually were caused by absentee ballots. So our experience has been that the conclusion of the Carter-Baker report that the absentee ballots are the one problematic area that could be shored up. That we believe that is still accurate. But in terms of ensuring ballot integrity, the single best thing to do is require voters to show ID prior to voting. And that's what we had for in-person voting. And after coming out of the 2020 election, there's no real question about the integrity and the accuracy of in-person voting. I think we put that to rest. We did the recount, hand recount, verified what the results were. And so we know the machines were accurate also. Through an emergency rule that we passed last year at the State Election Board, I also introduced an online absentee ballot portal that connected us to the Department of Driver Services in Georgia. We are Real ID compliant. And so that really, in effect, became photo ID. It's a very secure process. It only took 30 seconds or less to get your absentee ballot. So that was a great solution that we had last year. And we'll look at further improvements in the upcoming section. We obviously can talk about Senate Bill 202 that has many positive measures. We had been sued, just so you, in the interest of bipartisanship, we've been sued by both Democrats and Republicans on signature match. We now are moving away from that to a driver's license identification, very similar to the Minnesota law. And that's actually being used right now in red states and blue states. We believe it's a great way of moving forward. It's a very objective measure. And as an engineer, I love objectivity.
And as a son of an engineer, I can agree with that. Secretary Oliver, I think you're probably closest to being an election lifer among all of us. You have had a career in local election administration as well as your service at the state level. You've also been associated with efforts to expand access, especially to underrepresented populations like, say, folks living on tribal lands. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important and how you do that while still maintaining a commitment to integrity?
Sure. Well, thanks, Doug, for the good question. And I think it's important to emphasize, as former Secretary Priest said, there's always going to be that tension between access and integrity. You're never going to eliminate that entirely. And I also agree that it is really important to emphasize access, right? And also to do everything you can to ensure integrity. And so that's a tension that we're always going to be navigating. And as someone said, it may have also been Secretary Priest. The reality is you're never going to have a perfect election. There's never going to be a problem-free election in which every single eligible voter got their ballot swiftly and easily and had no problems, no hurdles to jump, and in which every single ballot cast was, perfectly sort of legal and had integrity, right? And so we have to do both things. So as far as access goes, particularly in a state like mine that is massive geographically, that has lots of pockets of small populations of people, one of the things that's been on the forefront of my mind as I've managed elections, as you mentioned, Doug, at the county and the state level, is that we do have these communities that are effectively they have inequity in terms of their access to the ballot box. Many of these communities don't have early voting available in their community. If you are living in Albuquerque, a major metropolitan area in this country, you can pretty much, drive around town and every mile or so you'll find an early voting site. But if you live in a rural tribal community, you may have 1 or 2 days of mobile early voting in your community, right? Otherwise, you may have to drive 20, 50, 80 miles to the nearest polling place on election day or to your county clerk's office in order to cast a ballot. So I like to think about access in those terms, because for me, at the end of the day, what I would really like is for every single voter in my state to have fundamentally equitable access to the ballot box. So that's why we've been working with the tribes in New Mexico to make policies that make sense. We also have to think about administration and the costs of administration, and the costs are not just financial costs. We're talking about recruiting and hiring and training individuals, making sure that we have the language, the minority language access, making sure that we have translation services available, making sure that when we do bring a mobile early voting site out to a community, that that community is going to take advantage of that early site, so that we're not sending not paying thousands of dollars to send someone out to a community where maybe one person's going to vote and they could have voted by absentee ballot. So these are all the things that we have to think about. But at the end of the day, everything that we can do to try to expand access for me comes down to a simple question of fundamental equity. And that is my sort of North Star as I'm looking at voting access in New Mexico.
Thank you. Let me turn now, something that's come up, I think, in everyone's remarks so far is this notion of misinformation or disinformation. And obviously the idea has evolved a little bit in a fairly short amount of time. I think in previous cycles, the concern was that there were external outside actors who were somehow seeking to affect or manipulate the American electoral process. In 2020, I think the concern was, like the horror movie, that the call was coming from inside the House. And I'll just throw this out to the panel generally. I mean, what is the threat that misinformation and disinformation poses to the American electoral process? And what can we as an election community, whether election officials or people who love them, do about that?
I'll speak first on that. I think the number one result of it is it destroys confidence. We've been talking about the two ends of the barbell, accessibility and integrity. I would really say it's accessibility and security, because I believe that what's in the middle is actually integrity. And what I've been telling everyone is what we have is 159 counties in Georgia. Yes, we have a lot of counties, but what holds the system together, because counties run the elections, is integrity, the personal integrity of the county election office. If you look at the Office of Secretary of State, our people are looking at how to run a fair and honest election. And I believe that I've shown I'll stand up for voter integrity. And that's very important. So when the system is solidified and strengthened with integrity, that's when you can have that balance between security and accessibility. Because when people take shots at the system, they're really taking shot at people's personal integrity. So as long as we continue to make sure our counties are populated with high integrity, high quality individuals, which they are, then that's the strength in the system. You just have to know that your county election director, your poll worker, is your neighbor that you go to Kiwanis with, chamber with, at church with. Those are good people. And as we said earlier, that most Americans are honest, good, decent, honest people. We need to remember that's who are on the other side of that plexiglass divider now. Those are your poll workers, and they have personal integrity.
And if I may, Doug, just to dovetail on what Secretary Raffensperger said, I think the challenge is, and this is where the rubber meets the road for us, is how do we ensure that the public understands the integrity that Secretary Raffensperger is talking about. And so it is one thing when you live in your community. In fact, I just got some data back. I'm working with the University of New Mexico Political Science Department. We polled voters in New Mexico about their election experience in 2020. And the officials, the elected officials with the highest marks in New Mexico are county clerks, right? Because voters trust their county clerk. They know them. They're familiar with them in their community. So to Brad's point, but then what gets lost is the translation as we go to the state level, as we go to the national level, right? I can trust my local county clerk. I know them. As Brad says, I may go to church with them or Kiwanis with them, but I don't know what that Secretary of State's doing. I don't know, what the Secretary of State and the county clerks in the other states are doing. We do a lot, and I don't care what election jurisdiction you are in this country, it may look a little different. We do a ton to ensure transparency of the process, to allow eyes, bipartisan, nonpartisan eyes on every step of the process to ensure that integrity that Secretary Raffensperger is talking about. And so the challenge is, A, to make sure folks know what those transparent processes are and how they too may have access to either watching or getting that information. But I also believe the flip side to that is quite frankly, and I don't know what this looks like, but really having a zero tolerance policy around people who lie or misrepresent what they are seeing in that process. And so that's really the sweet spot that we need to get to in election administration.
And if I could add, how do you deal with those lies when, you know, the person in charge of the country is telling those lies and keeps on telling those lies and gets media coverage that keep on promoting those lies? How do you combat that? Because there, as Susan said, you got 3/4 of Republicans who still believe the election was stolen. How, I mean, even today, how do you counter that so that people start believing that the election was fair and free, and, you know, former President Trump is former because he lost? And somehow we've got to be able to get that across. And Secretary Raffensperger, as Susan said, he's a hero. I mean, he stood up to some very, very difficult pressure, and he needs to be commended for that, not chastised by the party.
Actually, Representative Molinari, I want to jump on something that Secretary Oliver said about the data from New Mexico, that county clerks get high marks, but then confidence tails off as you get further away. That sounds reminiscent to me of all those polls about everybody loves their member of Congress, but is suspicious of the institution. As someone who has been a member and as someone as part of that institution, what lessons might we take for a way to help the folks for whom we do have trust to convince their voters that the entire system that they can't see, taste, and touch is also trustworthy? What can the individual do to create trust in the whole?
Look, I think these are all very difficult questions. And I think what we saw last year showed that, look, again, I think we might be a very different country today if we did not have elected officials or even people on the ground, right? There were times in Pennsylvania, Georgia, other places where the locals who were Republicans had to say, no, I watched the count. I've been here. They bear witness to the fact that there was, you know, a free and fair election. So I think we're just going to get to that point. It's asking an awful lot of people, the people who show up on election day, who are handing out their cards and just feel so excited to be a part of this, and now find themselves in this maelstrom of hate and distrust. But that's where, I mean, if you look back, if you start to play back, the TV shows that we were watching, the news shows, while the recounts were going on in certain areas, that's who made the difference. It was the people who were on the ground, who do this once a year or twice a year, who said, no, I voted for President Trump, but this is what the results were. We don't have a foolproof system yet. And before we leave this topic, we are also dealing with, when you said, like, okay, so those are the monsters in the house, the monsters outside of the house are getting more and more technologically adept and aggressive. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're keeping an eye on how they can best disrupt and learning how to do things. I know USC is doing a 50-state tour, talking to campaign managers, et cetera, people who are working the ballots, to talk about how they can best keep an eye out for cyber threats. NIST is going to be working with localities in terms of looking for that. But it's kind of hard sometimes to do everything we've all just talked about and then stay one step ahead of Russia, seeing as they did in 2016, the really sort of harnessing in and zeroing in on some of the social unrest and racial injustice issues we were having, and perpetrating events and things that were just not going on. And how does the average voter or individual know the difference? And so it's why I said, looking back at the Carter-Baker Commission, it's almost quaint, the things that we worried about compared to, the external influences and internal influencers that are trying to get us not to believe our eyes, right? I mean, that is where we have come. You can't believe everything what you hear and what you see. With regard to our elections, you just can't believe everything what you hear and what you see. And that was not always the case, at least in such large numbers.
So that brings up another interesting question. Obviously, social media is playing an outsized role in this process. It's almost sometimes the accelerant in the fire. That said, to what extent, and I'd be curious what anyone thinks, to what extent should the election community and election officials specifically be looking to either use or avoid social media to combat these kinds of problems? I mean, I know from my other work that often the very same safeguards that are used to ostensibly protect voters from misinformation are also used to, throttle's the wrong word, but to limit the ability of election offices to get information out to voters. To what extent can we help election officials or the election community generally use social media to help combat some of the worst mis or disinformation we're seeing out there?
Well, Doug, if I may, this is where I want to plug our National Association of Secretaries of State. I'm currently the president, have been serving since last summer, an incredibly interesting time, as you said, to be serving as president of NAS. But under my predecessor, Paul Pate of Iowa, and we created a program called Trusted Info 2020, hashtag Trusted Info 2020. Many of our states adopted this campaign to basically put the word out to try to encourage individuals to, when it comes to election information online, and particularly in social media, focus your attention, if you will, on trusted sources of information that is your local and state election officials. And obviously, to the extent that it was successful, it was because many of us utilized that campaign. But really at the end of the day, social media is a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, as I think everyone here would probably agree, elections are grossly underfunded in this country, and election officials are usually just doing everything we can to try to, scrape for look for change under the couch cushions to pay for things like voter education, which is, often the last thing that we are able to afford to do. It's very expensive in the most traditional way. So social media really provides us with an amazing opportunity to get information out to a vast majority of people, particularly in 2020 during COVID, when most folks were sitting at home and working on their computers all day long and on social media quite a bit. So on the one hand, in this last election, we were able to utilize social media to get out the word that, helped to produce that record-breaking voter turnout and participation that we were all so happy to see in 2020. But of course, the downside is the use of social media to spread lies and false claims and mis and disinformation. And I will say partners like Twitter, Facebook, they have been wonderful in working with us to help pull down false information and about election administration, but it's a game of whack-a-mole and it's hugely challenging.
One of the things that I think would take a long time. It's not going to happen overnight, but we haven't done a good job of teaching our kids civics, or how does government work. We don't, maybe they have a couple of classes, or when I was Secretary of State, I was that class. I would go to speak to a class at school and talk to them about how government operates. My favorite question to ask was, who's my boss? And I got lots of varying answers, but they are my boss. And I don't think people really look at it in that way. And I think we need to spend the time and the money to educate, starting in school, maybe 5th, 6th grade, and going up through high school, and even political science, yes, but even just a basic class in university that needs to be taught. How does government operate? Why do we have elections? How best to deal with it? We're not ever going to do away with social media now. When people come to me and ask me how best to run an election, I'm not sure I'm the best person to tell them these days, because quite frankly, I never used social media when I was running for office. And I still think people like the personal touch of you knocking on their door, but when you're running statewide, that's sort of difficult to do. So I think we have to use the tools that are available, the science of technology. Surely, to goodness, I believe that there are enough brilliant people in this country to overcome what the Chinese and Russians are doing to try to to disrupt us and our elections.
Okay, I guess I'm the last one to answer. Once again, I will be the skunk at the garden party. I think we are facing a really critical time in our country with regard to how our elections are run and how they're reported. I shouldn't say run, how they're reported. I mean, when we go back to the last election, first, let's take disinformation. Just the ability for social media companies to try and do their best to take off disinformation or misinformation off their sites. You're absolutely right. It's a game of whack-a-mole. It's, you know, you can get it right 1 second and then it pops right back up again. But also look at where the social media companies are today. You know, they're getting sued or may lose their liability protection because somebody who might put up that disinformation or somebody's misinformation is somebody else's truth. And so they too are in the middle of, you know, are you taking away the president's Twitter account or an ability for somebody to say this about the recount that's going on in any area? So, I mean, that's a real problem. I also think, you know, when we think back to the election and, you know, those tense days after the election, we're talking about civics. I never knew that there was any ability for electors in states or the United States Congress to overturn the will of the voter. Like, I think there's some real, we were really challenged last year as a country. And I think we need to have, you know, as Sharon said, you know, smarter people than I am in terms of bringing together, you know, a commission or people to just look at all those ways this could have gone really wrong and not count on, you know, the heroism or 1 or 2 individuals in each state to save us. So I think there are some problems with regard to social media. There's problems with regard to access. You know, there's no reason why anybody should not have the ability to vote because they're on a Native American land, or even the fact that we got to the point this last election of questioning whether we were going to open military ballots because they came in a little late. Like, should that not be the first thing we look at, that the men and women who are serving us overseas have their vote protected? Like, that should be number one in terms of what we do as a nation going forward. So I'm sorry, you're probably sorry you even asked me to come to this, because I just think there's some really serious problems. And we talk about people trusting the integrity of the system, what we talked about 16 years ago. It didn't come close to dealing with the issues we had to face. I mean, you know, we all were like, oh my God, remember when hanging chads, like, remember when hanging chads were controversial? You know, well, you know, that seems easy compared to what we've been through in the last election. So.
Sufficient unto the day or the troubles thereof, right? Secretary Raffensperger, any thoughts on this?
No, I think you pretty much covered it all. Talked it to death. My biggest concern really is misinformation, disinformation. How do you stop it? And I don't have an answer for that yet. We obviously have been through 2 election cycles here in Georgia. We just continue to speak out. We have a very strong, robust public relations. We're out there on Twitter. We're out there on Facebook. But we have to understand that the number of Twitter followers we have is nowhere near what national figures have. So it's a tough battle. You're always going to be outnumbered, but you just continue to speak the truth. And that's the most important thing, is that over time, if you speak the truth, people will realize that you did speak the truth. It comes out. And then hopefully people just have to realize and accept it. You don't have to like the results, but you can still accept them. And I know that from my speaking as a Republican, that we would prefer the election went in a different way, but we have to accept the results because the numbers showed what the numbers showed.
So let me wrap up at least this part of the conversation before we get to some audience questions. What's one thing, and maybe I'll start with you, Secretary Priest and Representative Molinari. What's one thing that you think that we as a nation have done well since Carter Baker with regard to preserving both access and integrity? Give me a success story. You're muted, Sharon.
There we go. I think the discussions that we had on voter ID, I'm a Democrat, and I will probably get flack for this, but I've never had major issues with requiring voter identification at the polls. That's never been an issue really for me. I understand the issue. I understand the problems, particularly in rural parts of the state, probably in New Mexico with some of the tribal areas. But I do think, we have to have IDs for so many other things that voter ID hasn't been such a big deal to me. And so I think our recommendation on voter ID was really good and important to integrity.
Well, and it's probably one of the least easy aspects to resolve, although 76% of American voters, Republican and Democrat, believe in requiring an ID. But I am, and I remember we were meeting during one of our hearings, one of our national leaders, racial justice national leaders actually said, maybe it's better if the federal government or the states took over, providing these IDs so that you could make sure, have a guaranteed system of making sure that we get to the places that are hard to get to, that like access should just not be an issue in terms of creating and giving access to these IDs. And that's sort of where we always come down, right? I mean, I'm, probably, not the typical Republican, as anybody could tell from watching this, but, also I was one of 14 who voted for motor voter. I just think making it easier for people to vote is the bottom line, whether they vote for me or not, like, that's just what we're all here for. So I think we really have to come to grips with how we deal with making sure that everyone has that access, that again, that people can have trust and integrity, but that also means that those people who are asking for those things in terms of integrity also have to stand up for, easy mail-in ballots, more drop boxes, looking at those places where some people wait online for 4 hours and other people wait online for 4 minutes. Why is there a discrepancy? I mean, I think we have to take in total where there are problems in the system if we're going to push it forward one way or the other. And, I do think, again, the Carter-Baker Commission, a lot of what we talked about, some of it just went away, right? Because I think we had an assumption that everything was going to be done online at that point. And I remember actually, and then I'll stop the glory days, I was trying to work with the Pentagon and how we could get the military to make sure that their votes were counted. And I said, I really talked to a very senior level about military who are overseas being able to vote online. And of course, there was always that issue of, people being able to access it or hack it. And the general I was talking to said, we actually encrypt pretty sophisticated information that we don't want hacked. Well, I brought that back to the commission to just look at. Most of the Democrats didn't want to even think about the idea of giving the military access online because, Sharon, I'm not talking about you, but just in general, because they thought they would vote Republican. And the Republicans didn't want it because they thought if we started to move towards people being able to vote online, the more people who voted wouldn't vote Republican. So, we just get to this mess. I mean, maybe that wasn't the right thing to look at now that we're looking at, how we need paper ballot backups in order to give everyone assurances that the vote is right. But those were not the right answers for why we shouldn't have done it. But I don't think that surprises anybody here that that's what I heard.
So let me ask a version of that question to Secretaries Oliver and Raffensperger, obviously without tethering it to the Carter-Baker report. But what's something that you feel like the community has gotten right in the last decade or so on balancing access and integrity?
I'll just jump in. I think, and I will tether it to Carter-Baker, I think we've made tremendous progress with regard to list maintenance and sharing data across, not just across state lines, but across counties within states. I mean, we now have centralized voter registration databases, and we now have ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which In fact, almost half of the states and DC are members of, we're sharing information with each other about when voters move across state lines. We're getting Social Security master death file information so we can remove deceased voters. We're updating voter registration information as folks move from place to place. And we're reducing duplicates. We're reducing the either possibility for voters to be registered and voting in more than one place. And when we find that, we are able to make sure that is the correct person and, you know, bring legal action, right, when that's necessary. And that all important enforcement piece, you know, that we were talking about earlier. Really, technology has brought us to a place where we've been able to do that. I think, you know, and as you pointed out, Doug, I was a county clerk for many years. So from when I started in 2007 running elections at a county level to where we are now, it is an order of magnitude improved. And I think that's one thing, embracing online voter registration, automated and automatic voter registration, all those things have helped us make sure that our voter registration lists are up to date and accurate.
Secretary Raffensperger?
I think probably one big takeaway from the Carter Baker report is if you ever have an issue trying to vote, then you can always vote provisionally. That was a big takeaway, provisional ballots, and really, I think, imprinted across all states. So that is a big takeaway. The other one is that photo ID was recommended, and I think studies have shown and practice has shown it doesn't reduce turnout. It also restores confidence. I think Georgia has joined ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center, to make sure that our lists are accurate, because that's another confidence builder, because people are always saying, do these people still live in Georgia? And those kind of questions that you have. I think that federal laws need to be updated. I think one of the things that people have overlooked is how mobile our society is. We have nearly 8 million voters. And if national numbers say that 11% move, that's over 800,000 voters that are moving every year in Georgia, in-state, out-state, in-county, out-of-county, precinct, out of precinct. And so we have a very mobile society, and that's one area I think that needs to be shored up. I think ERIC is a great way of doing it objectively, not subjectively. And so those provisional ballots, so would be my number one takeaway. I always smile when I read that, because whenever we have an issue that comes to fore in election a law, we're always saying, well, make sure that they can always vote provisional no matter what the situation is.
Thank you. So lots of questions from the audience. We've had such a great discussion so far. We don't have a whole lot of time, but one really good one that we got that maybe I'll throw to the secretaries first and then to our former commissioners. If the commission were formed today, what issue or issues would you tackle first? And I'm not asking you for a solution, but if you've got one, feel free. But what are the big to-dos on our list going forward?
Go ahead, Maggie.
Go ahead.
You can take it, Maggie. You go first.
I was kicking it to you. I think Brad will say the same thing, but you know, at running the risk of being too much on the same page, mis and disinformation, and how we combat that, how we do a better job, you know, as we had the previous discussion of educating the public and letting them know what we do in order to preserve the integrity of the election process and to make sure that votes are tallied and reported accurately, and how we can, you know, sort of better communicate that. I think that is I think one of the most crucial things. And in addition to that, you know, perhaps recommendations about how we can do a better job of that.
I think number one, obviously, would be cybersecurity, continue to strengthen that. When we have our meetings at NAS, I would think that probably a third of our meetings are about cybersecurity. We understand how critically important that is. Voter list management is another one, making sure we have updated voter rolls. And I really also would make sure going forward that the EAC remains as a truly bipartisan board. Some people say, well, nothing ever happens, but that's a good thing. because then it truly is bipartisan. Because if all of a sudden it's 3-2, then who's the president? And then you feel like you're being pushed into a corner because the other side has the votes. So if it truly is 2-2, then they have to really work together and come up with bipartisan solutions, just like the Carter-Baker report did in 2005. And that's a good thing when it relates to, we have a two-party system by and large in America, and you have two different worldviews, different politics. But when we come together and agree on the big issues, I think that's very important.
I would just echo what the secretaries have said, particularly with regard to the EAC. That was something we saw as a very important arbiter of the truth, right? A place where they would have an eye out for what was going on, and that both sides could either agree or disagree, but would have to trust. And I think in recent years, it has not been given the authority or the resources that it needs to play a very vital role. So I really see the EAC, and quite frankly, our secretaries of state, really having such an important role in modeling what we need to do going forward. This is an organization that truly, obviously, brings forth some amazing leaders, have figured out ways to work together in ways that some of our national leaders and places of legislative affairs have not been able to do. And so I just think we just need, if Carter-Baker were to be established again, certainly misinformation, all those things that come up, but an ability to update. I mean, when you talk about list maintenance, I just keep thinking back to Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey, where that happened almost on election day or the day before. And, working with all the social media companies, we were able to change voting locations on a dime and get that information out to everyone. And people trusted that election, even though it was happening in the midst of a national disaster. So if we can do that, because we really needed to and wanted to, I believe that we can have to give a little more assurances to our voters who are showing up at the polls and getting the information out to people who need it.
And I would say one of the things, the first thing I wrote down was disinformation and misinformation, cybersecurity. But I think one of the things that elections have been underfunded for years and years and years. So making sure that there are enough funds to truly to truly make sure that elections are free and fair. I mean, that's what the people in this country want, and that's what they deserve.
And any thoughts, Sharon, or anyone else on how that might work, what that might look like? Do we need to rely on legislatures to do regular appropriations? Might there be something in the Q&A that suggested that maybe candidate fundraising should be tapped to help defray some of that cost? What might we do to provide funds to the nation's election administration system?
Well, I think going to candidates to try to get funds, I think that's very difficult. I mean, I don't know what other states do, but to try to raise money to be Secretary of State in Arkansas was a real challenge. So I don't know that that's the way to go. Legislators or state legislators, legislators need to understand. I mean, they're all elected. If they want free and fair elections, they need to understand the value of funding things like, well, initially motor voter. I remember I had to stand outside the chamber and keep everybody in there to get the motor voter passed. So they need to understand. And, we were talking about, when I was talking about education, we have a lot of legislators who really don't know what their job is. So it's important for them to understand what they're supposed to do, and then secondly, the value of funding it. They won't like that, but.
So one more, and this risks being kind of a big one, and maybe this is more of a lightning round, but a couple of questions in the Q&A about rethinking the model of election administration from partisan elected officials to some sort of nonpartisan system. Thoughts on whether that's valuable, whether that's solving a problem that doesn't exist?
you know, the Secretary of State in Washington State introduced legislation this year to make her position nonpartisan, and she became immediately suspect. So, I mean, I don't know that, I don't know if we need to change the model. I mean, the thing is making sure voters are educated and elect good, solid people that they trust to carry out the duties and responsibilities.
A system of checks and balances built into any election process is the key, because the reality is that at any given time in any given place, whether or not you have a nonpartisan position or a partisan position, you're going to have an individual in that position that's got their own political point of view, right? We're all humans. So making sure you have a system in place with adequate checks and balances and nonpartisanship built into the system is the key. I like to brag about our system in New Mexico to say that, you know, we have a system that's so nonpartisan and transparent that I couldn't rig an election even if I wanted to. And I truly believe that. And I also would never want to. You know, that's really the key. I think that there is something to be said about de-emphasizing partisanship in these elections and in these processes. And unfortunately, where we are as a country is that we, you know, the partisanship has completely moved into the election administration space. I mean, these topics are radioactive on both sides of the aisle. And so it's, you know, up to this kind of dialogue and this kind of group of people coming together and people on both sides of the aisle in their own individual capacities to really start to put a damper on this toxic partisan rhetoric in order to, you know, make that need for, okay, let's create this nonpartisan position, you know, to have that be sort of a salve on the problem, I mean, isn't going to really necessarily accomplish the goal.
Anybody else?
Well, I would just add that, you know, I would be suspect of anyone who says I'm nonpartisan. I mean, everybody's partisan and should have, not everybody's partisan, everybody has ideological ideas. And so I think I think one, it makes it more suspect. Look, again, I'll, you know, beat this horse. One of the things that saved us this election were that there were Republicans who stood up in various states and said, no, this was a free and fair election. If a nonpartisan person said this was a free and fair election, you know, I don't know where the Republicans would still be. So I think it was important that we had people, and, you know, Secretary Raffensperger is going to be like, leave me alone. But, you know, people like him who were able to stand up and say, yes, I'm partisan, I'm a Republican, but this is what the facts are. I think that was so important. And I think by saying then that our elected officials shouldn't be partisan, what a sad statement we are making on the people who are running our process. Like, we should, like, don't let them off the hook. Like, everybody should just be reporting the facts, no matter who you are. That is the fundamental underpinnings of our democracy. And if we think if we're all of a sudden at a point like that where people can't do that, then we've got bigger problems.
Secretary Raffensperger, you get the chair's last word if you want it.
Well, in many respects, we're like a referee, and our job is to call balls and strikes. And as it relates to the election process, we may lean left or we may lean right, but election process, our job is to look right down the center line and call balls and strikes. And as long as you have that ability, that courage, that integrity, then things will work out just fine. And so I believe that what we have in place will work. We all bring our biases, as we've all said. I'm on this side of the aisle, others on that side of the aisle, but we're looking at that personal integrity. Keep, you know, that part of the politics out of the vote counting, and things work out just fine.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to turn it back over to our hosts in a second, but I do want to thank everybody for participating, both on the panel and the people joining us today. You're going to be hearing about some more of these events going forward. I've enjoyed being a part of it. I'm looking forward to the future conversations. With that, I'll turn it back over to John. John?
Thank you, Doug, and thanks to everyone for joining today's discussion. Special thanks go to the panel members. This was a thoughtful, frank, and enlightening discussion, and we all appreciate it. Please Please join us again for our next discussion that starts at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, April the 28th. The topic of that program will be voting by mail. Until then, stay healthy, make sure you get your vaccinations, and please continue to wear masks and observe social distancing recommendations. Thank you and good day.